Got it.
Okay,
Yeah,
now
I guess you can start, Arianna. You already have
I
more
share
than
the
30
screen
people.
again. Just a second. Good afternoon to everyone. Buon pomeriggio a tutti, and welcome to today's web talk featuring Italian diplomat Fabrizio Nava, entitled True North, Still True, Canada Seen Through Italian Eyes. My name is Arianna Dagnino, and I am the Cultural Events Coordinator of the Dante Societies in Vancouver. Before we delve into today's discussion, however, and as previously mentioned in our newsletter, we would like to take a moment to commemorate Marco Nobili, the Consul General of Italy in Vancouver, who sadly died from a heart attack just 1 week ago. Marco is survived by his wife and 2 children. Fabrizio Nava, a colleague of Marco's, will share a few words, and the president of our society, Renato Zane, will also offer his thoughts. So I leave to Fabrizio Nava now the podium and the voice.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I was texting with Marco until last week. I'd invited him to attend today's presentation. He was very happy with with this opportunity, and of course, we were all shocked by the news of his passing. Marco was a person who loved life, jovial, with a very positive attitude. He loved his job, loved his family, and had a very, I would say, positive approach to everything. He was an all-around person. His biography is quite interesting. He was a police officer. He was a swimming then he joined the Foreign Service. Before that, however, he took 4 diplomas, 4 degrees. And then he served abroad in Sudan, in Split, in Detroit. And he was very happy of the opportunity of serving in Vancouver. And of course, he only had a few months to experience life in Vancouver. He will be missed for sure.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for these words. And now let's also have Renato Zane say a few words in commemoration of Marco Nobili.
Thanks, Arianna, and thank you, Fabrizio. Hello, everybody. I completely agree with everything Fabrizio just said. I only knew Marco Nobili for a very short time. Stefano, our vice president, and myself met with him at the consulate on October the 18th. It was in October of 2023 for an initial get-together session. And he really struck me as the kind of person who jumps right in and takes an opportunity to make an impact right away. Very, as Fabrizio said, very jovial. The thing that struck me was how much energy, dynamism, and a sense of community that Marco Nobili felt and exuded. He was very modern as far as consuls go, in the sense that he was very active on social media. Some of you may have seen some of the social media posts. He really believed in social media in terms of reaching out and connecting with people. And what was fascinating in a way was how much of this work he did himself. He was posting and he was suggesting the photographs for certain occasions, and really wanted to instill in all of the groups that he met this the sense that we need to collaborate and work together. You know, with Stefano and myself, he talked a lot about his philosophy, which was not to necessarily reinvent the wheel when it comes to cultural events or new initiatives. He suggested that we learn from other jurisdictions and other groups what has worked in the past and try to emulate that here in Vancouver. And I really appreciated that perspective. We met again in November when we got together with other language schools in the Lower Mainland. And again, he was trying to prod us and push us to work together in order to maximize the potential funding from the Italian government for events that showed connecting fibers. So on the one hand, commerce with Italy, and on the other hand, cultural and educational events. And the other thing that really struck me about Marco was how young he seemed, and that also adds to the tragedy of his sudden passing. He really believed in youth and wanted us to find ways to reach out to young people especially. And it is a challenge for us. As we look at our screen, we see that the people that attend our cultural events are not in the younger demographic. We all have a certain experience in life, let's say, and it would be great to find ways to involve more young people. So I will remember that from Marco, and I share the shock, the sense of shock, and especially for Francesca Bormolini, the secretary at the consulate, and the other staff that worked closely with him and were energized by his presence. So I wanted to thank him, even though he's not here, for his stimulus, and I appreciate that, and we will try to carry it forward and see what we can create together. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato, and to all of you for this moment of commemoration. And now let me introduce you to today's speaker and the discussion theme. Fabrizio Nava joined the diplomatic service in 1995, holding various roles at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. His postings included the Italian embassies in New Delhi and Ottawa, where he served as head of the commercial office and later as deputy head of mission. Additionally, he served as Consul General in Houston, Texas, currently stationed in Warsaw at the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. He leads the Office of the Director. Nava is the author of True North, Journey into the Identity of Canada. And today he will draw on this book of his to explore what it means to be a Canadian nowadays and whether lessons from a multicultural society and its involvement in peacekeeping efforts globally can aid in navigating the complexities of an increasingly fractured world marked by conflicting elements and perspectives. You can buy his book, which is now so far written only and published only in Italian, directly through him by email or on Amazon. But now let me just stop sharing this PowerPoint and leave the floor to Fabrizio for his presentation.
Thank you, Arianna. Thanks to the Dante Alighieri Society of British Columbia for having me, and thanks to all of you for attending. Well, as you heard from my bio, I lived in Canada for a total of 8 years. I've experienced 8 Canadian winters. And adding on that, the 4 years I lived in the US, that gave me quite a unique perspective on North America and on Canada in particular. One of my jobs was, when I was in Ottawa, was of assisting delegations coming from Italy, and often I found myself explaining to them what Canada was about. And that gave me the curiosity to elaborate a little further on this, because I realized that in Italy, very few people know Canada. Rather, everybody has an impression of what Canada is about, but digging deep is something that has not really been attempted many times. And I thought that I could leverage my experience to try and fill this gap. So as an introduction, my work is primarily aimed at Italians, Europeans in general. And of course, it can stimulate some thinking also on part of Canadians to see if they agree on this image which I made, or if there is more to elaborate on. So I began by clearing the deck by misperceptions. Looking at Canada from Europe, people often think that either Canada is a projection of Europe in the North American continent, a different version of North America, more closer to our parameters with Medicare and with the different kind of society, Others tend to think that Canada is a projection northwards of the United States. Of course, both perceptions are wrong. There is a grain of truth in it, but Canada is much more than that. So I began elaborating on what actually makes the Canadian identity. Yeah, this is the reason why I chose this title, True North, a journey into the identity of Canada. And the journey begins with a general overview on Canada's dimension and nature, something which Europeans are not accustomed to. The sheer size of Canada, and also having this ever-present coexistence with nature. Nature in Canada is not tamed. It is a wild, unpredictable element which can nourish your soul, but can freeze you if you are distracted, if you cannot approach it carefully. If you're lost in any Italian park, you just walk in a straight line and you will be on a road. If you're lost in any park in Canada, well, sign of the cross and hope everything goes fine. And on this, there is also this unique relationship that Canada has with the North, with the Arctic. Canada sees itself as a Nordic country, a country of long winters. There is a French poem that goes, Mon pays, ce n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver. My country is not a country, it's winter. And on this foundation, I began digging into Canada's history, beginning, of course, with the First Nation. And the first quote is from the Haida myth of creation, to say that history does not begin with Giovanni Caboto, but goes back several thousands of years with the First Nations. And there I look at Canada's evolution, first through the years of European colonization, then to what happened when Canada expanded westwards. I spent a little longer on the 20th century because that's where Canadian identity began to take shape. I like to say that Canada entered the 20th century as a British outpost, or at least that thought of itself as being British, even though inside Canada there were already the seeds of diversity, and ended the 20th century as one of the world's most successful experiments in multiculturalism. Of course, this was not easy, and Canada had its challenges, many of them, but managed to overcome successfully, I would say. And then from there, I begin looking at certain specific aspects that make Canada. I would say that the multiculturalism element is introduced by what happened in Quebec between the 70s and the 90s, because I think that is important. That's when the concept of country and nation perhaps were taken differently. What Pierre Trudeau said was that Canada is a country that is greater than the nation, so it should enclose all the nations that form it. It was like at the time, it was considered a way to keep Quebec in, so to make sure that French Canadians felt at home in the whole of Canada. And I know that in Western Canada, it was not received well by a number of people, but it worked, and it opened the way for a different version of the Canadian identity, which was not just the Anglo one, but was much broader and has formed the base of what Canada is living through today. And from there, I look at elements like the economy of Canada. The provincial dimension is something that Europeans are simply not accustomed to. The fact that in order to understand Canada, you have to understand the provinces. You have to understand the relationship between Ottawa and the provinces, between the local and central, and that so many powers are vested in the provinces. That interest may change between the Maritimes, Central Canada, the Prairies, and Western Canada. And then, of course, there is the North, the Arctic on top of all this. So, and this is something which I try to explain. Looking at the economy, that's also important to underscore that Canada is maybe the G7 country where the primary sector is still so important. So you have to, when you address Canada, you must be aware of the relevance of energy, of raw materials, and at the same time of advanced mechanics, technology, and all that makes progress. The second part of the book looks a little closer into the identity of Canada proper, the components that make this identity. So we begin by looking at Canada's neighborhood, which is made of one country, and the relations that Canadians have with the United States. I found it to be a very interesting relation, having seen it from both sides. And what I noticed, for instance, is that Canadians are all very much aware that they are neighboring the US, that the United States is the world's leading country. And the ambivalence maybe is that on one side, Canadians look up to the United States as seeing it as what it is, maybe the world's most successful country. But at the same time are also very, can I say, sneaky at looking at everything that's wrong in American society. I found an aphorism that translates this and says that while Americans are benevolently ignorant about Canada, Canadians are maliciously informed about the US. And of course, this might bring people to think that Canadian and American society are on a converging path. This was maybe true 20 years ago in terms of the perception when I was first in Canada. But when I returned in the past decade, I found that Canadians were much more aware of their identity. And I realized that the US maybe is more an individual-centered society, while Canada tends to be more community-oriented. And then there are some features that make Canada unique. I would say that that of having a state which is interventionist, having reforms that are promoted from top below. At least that was the case in the second half of the 20th century, just looking at Medicare, but also at other things that have been promoted by a state that at the time was perceived as having an influence on society. Of course, now things have changed and government interference sometimes is not liked by some, but still I think that it's a distinctive element between Canada and the US. Multiculturalism, I think, is an important element of Canada. Of course, it's an element that Canadians are very proud of. It's a feature of Canadian society that Canadians like to show to the world. And it is largely functional. Canada is a country that is maybe a unique case of having a lot of diversity within its borders, but very few tensions coming from them. So the mechanism has worked so far. As I said, this was born out of a Canadian necessity, which was that of keeping French Canada within the Confederation, within Canada as a concept, more than as a political entity, and grew on that. So it's a Canadian answer to a Canadian issue. I don't think that it can be simply transported everywhere, but it shows that multiculturalism can work. And I think that is the underlying message that that comes from Canada. We must not be afraid of change. And then I look at two elements, three actually. The first one is the First Nations. The discovery of the First Nations, discovery quote unquote, is a relatively recent phenomenon in Canada. Already during my first posting, the First Nations were seen as something folkloric that belonged more to the past. But the awareness of having the First Nations as a distinct element of Canadian identity is something which is quite new and which I found to be very interesting, if not fascinating. I remember that all the G7 meetings which I attended in 2018 were opened by a blessing from an elder from a local First Nation. And some very beautiful things were said in that context. And then also look at the Italian-Canadian community, which is quite big. We're talking about 1.5 million Italian Canadians, Canadians of Italian origin, who played a role in Canada's society, but also in its history. And because Italians have been in Canada right since the beginning of the French landings, there were Italians if not in Samuel de Champlain's first mission, surely in the ones that followed. And while concentrated largely in the metros, they contributed a lot to Canada's growth. And then we look at, the book ends with the challenges of the 21st century, the fact that I was very much interested by the concept of the end of the Laurentian consensus, something which was discussed about 10 years ago when Western Canada and the prairies proved to be a place where elections can be won. I'm talking about when the Conservatives were elected. And I thought that this was, aside from the political dimension, which is something which can be, of course, discussed, what I found interesting is that for 2 centuries, Canada was declined primarily as the axis going from Quebec City to Toronto. That's where things happened. And this is less and less the case. Today's country is much more diverse and much more multipolar, I would say, multi-centered. And then the book ends with the answer to the question, which is, what is the Canadian identity? Well, the answer which I give is that the Canadian identity is a work in progress. There is not an arrival line. Each generation adds something to what the previous one built, and this identity is changing and morphing. And I think that is the most difficult thing to grasp for Italians and for Europeans in general, because we're used to very static identities. I mean, Italians have been Italians for centuries. And you can say the same for Germans, for Poles, for many of us. Canadians are an evolving identity. As I said before, the country entered the 20th century as an Anglo bastion, even though within its border, not everyone was Anglo, and exited the 20th century as maybe the most successful multicultural experiment in history, and provides, again, a beam of confidence for those of us who think that the future can be a better place. So this is the panorama which I wanted to give you. And maybe we can discuss if there are some aspects that you want to dig deeper into.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for this outline, a brief outline of what you have included in your book. I know there will be a lot of questions. Perhaps I can just open up the floor if there is anyone who would like to raise their hands. Otherwise, I have a question for you. Before you can still raise your hands while I am asking this question. You talked about the fact, and it's very intriguing, of this idea of the Canadian identity as a kind of a work in progress, a shift in identity that changes from one generation to the other. And I'm wondering whether in this current state of affairs in which nationalisms are the national identities are getting stronger and stronger and more conflictual than ever, this kind of suppleness and flexibility in one's identity can be seen as a point of strength or a point of weakness?
Well, thank you. That's an interesting question. My first answer is that, yes, it is a point of strength because this navigates the uncertainties of the present with the flexibility. This permits to have an identity which adapts to changing circumstances. The downside, perhaps, is that the core identity is not so clear. I mean, in the case of Canada, you say multiculturalism, respect for minorities, which is, of course, everybody agrees with. But the core identity of what makes Canada is a little more elusive. When I was in the United States, I remember that there is awareness of diversity a lot more than there was 20, 30 years ago. And then I'm in Texas. The Hispanic world is so present, but also the African-American dimension. So there is awareness of diversity and, of course, immigration coming in all the time. But at the same time, core USA is very visible. It has its symbol, its myths, its rights. And the American identity is, I think, very strong. The Canadian is more nuanced, less assertive, I would say, but not less effective, because Canadians in the end are united by a set of values, and that's what creates the basis. I mean, the values that is what keeps a community together. And so, yes, I think that having an identity that is not exclusive, we spoke about Europe before, we're having now trouble, I would say, culturally, more than politically or juridically, in adapting to second, third, fourth generation migrants who come from a different history and maybe don't even look like the natives, simply because our identities are much more consolidated. And seeing that in Canada, this is not an issue at all, I think is something that, in perspective, makes Canadian society much more solid.
Thank you, Fabrizio. I see Michela Valmori has a question. Please, Michela. Yeah. And you're welcome either to write your questions in the chat or to raise your hand through the little hand.
If you do prefer, Arianna, I might also dial it. I might also type my question in the chat.
No. It's good that you can better. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for this very insightful, perspective of the way in which Canada is seen through Italian eyes. And my question is actually partially connected to the one that Arianna's just asked, because I spent my entire PhD, let's say after my PhD, my entire career in researching in the migration of Italians to America, because my family is Italian American. But actually, then I came to Canada, and that was something very unexpected, but I'm so happy to be here. And I'm trying to step my first, foot into the diaspora of Italians in Canada. So I was wondering if you had the chance to investigate what is the impact of the Italian migration in Canada as regards also the diversity and the background that you just described with Arianna. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that when the Italians arrived in the 60s and the 70s, maybe it was the first touch of exotism that came to Canada. Migration that come until then primarily from Northern and Central Europe, and this was the first migration of quote-unquote Southerners. And I would add on that the Italian migration that came to Canada was different than the one that went to the US, because, well, first of all, socially, it was more like middle class. The Italians who came to Canada were able to insert much more quickly into society because they had their own set of skills. And many of them went into construction or in trade. And I think that the greatest testimony to Canada's adaptability that I was talking about a moment ago is that it took Italian Americans several generations to climb up the ladder, while Italian Canadians that arrived to Canada made it to the top in the first generation. A few years ago, I met the commander of the RCMP. I mean, what is more iconic than the RCMP, the Mounties, the Redcoats? Well, the commander was Giuliano Zaccardelli, born in Sulmona, L'Aquila. And that didn't make him any less Canadian. So chapeau to Canada for doing this. And well, you cannot imagine Toronto without the Italian community, of course. The Italian contribution, of course, has been very much across the board. It brought entrepreneurship, it brought construction, it brought a lot. There is also I like to say that Italian Canadians did a unique thing to keep Canada together, because when there was the Quebec referendum in 1995, when Quebec voted again on its independence, and the referendum failed by just 50,000 votes. The Italian-Canadian community in Quebec at the time was 250,000, and they massively voted for the Confederation. So if you do a little math, you see that Italians certainly played a key role in keeping Canada together. And well, I met with the community. My experience is largely centered into the central provinces, Ontario primarily, and Quebec. And there I noticed a phenomenon which I noticed also in the US, which is that I find that there are difficulties between the old migration and the new migration in communicating. The old migration is the one that came with an idea to settle. They came and they put their families, will make a new life, and they remain sentimentally attached to the old country, to the point of perpetuating traditions like the Sunday Mass, where you dress your best, and big Sunday lunches, and the procession with the saint and all that, which maybe are not as felt in Italy. the new migration, if we can call it that, is made of professionals who move around, expats, who maybe spend 3 years in Toronto and 3 years in Warsaw, then they move to Houston for some time and then go to Dubai. So I found that these two communities have difficulties in talking to each other. So the challenge that also as consuls we have is that of bringing them together.
Thank you, Fabrizio. There is a question in the chat before we also have another question from Rosie. So the question from Renata. When I visit Italy, it seems the younger generation wants to imitate the Canadian USA. Do you agree? Your view on Italian migrants early 50s compared to the ones that are coming to Canada today, I mean, is part of that answer perhaps, but perhaps you would like to say something more about the Italians who are in Italy and look at Canada as a kind of a new, you know, golden Eden for them as from a professional point of view.
Indeed. Well, Italians have looked with longing towards North America for at least a century. I mean, North America was seen as the place where things could be done. I mean, the land of opportunities, the place where you could become rich. And this is part of a myth that was, of course, promoted by migration, by cinema, by all the things we know. And so, yes, even today, young people look up to North America as a place to be. Of course, the US is the main draw, but at the same time, the US is seen is a bit scary for some because it's so hard, fast, competitive, and the idea is that if you win everything, but then if you fall down, nobody picks you up. So Canada is seen as a kinder, gentler version of North America. Maybe not as exciting, but with some assurances that you do not get down south. As I said before, Italians, Europeans can relate more to the Canadian world because there is like a stronger government intervention, which is what we're used to. There is Medicare. Then the law and order situation is seen as much more under control, even though the numbers can be read in many ways. Yes, I would say that young people certainly do look positively towards North America, towards the US, towards Canada. They would like to have this experience at least once in their lives. And I certainly see it as a place where one could go to study and to maybe develop a career. Actually, you'd be interested, but after Brexit, there are more and more young people that I hear from that are interested in pursuing a Canadian education, just because the UK has become so difficult to access. So yes, I would say that I would agree with that.
Thank you. And Eloise, would you like to ask your question by unmuting yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Fabrizio. So both my sets of grandparents came here in the late 1800s. And there was a huge wave of Italians that came from there. A lot from Calabria, where my dad's family came from. I'm wondering whether they are mentioned in your book as part of the Italian diaspora.
Yes, they are. I actually tried to draw a history of Italian migration. It came in several waves. Of course, there was a tiny migration that came in the right up to the 1800s, mostly towards Quebec, because religion was considered at the time what was much more important than it is today. So Italians would go to a Catholic region, then they expanded all over Canada. But yes, that is mentioned. Although by numbers, the largest waves came in the 1930s and especially from the 60s to the 70s. So yes, they're mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Mark Otwell, would you like to ask your question?
I have a second thing to say, please, Arianna.
Go ahead then.
Thank you. I just, you had said that you felt that Canadian people look up to those in the United States. And I know I don't, and I know most of the people I know don't. So I'm wondering whether that could be softened a bit.
Of course, I can elaborate more. Maybe more than the people, I would say that Canadians recognize that the US is indeed a great country. And one of the indicators of success for a Canadian artist or business person is to make it down south. And that's something which I know is in Canadian society. But at the same time, Canadians are, more than anyone, know what's wrong with the United States and can read into the dark corners of the American dream, and are always ready to point out when there is maybe too much, what can you call it, jingoism from the American side, to point out what is actually wrong with it. I found that, but I would say that the main difference is between the two is that Canadians are very much informed about the US success and downturns. Americans are usually uninformed about Canada. They don't know much. They have a generally benign image, but one that does not have a direct experience. All Canadians sooner or later travel down south. Very few Americans make it up north. So, but yes, I agree with you in the fact that Canadians don't generally admire the US. They respect the US, of course. They recognize its positive sides, but more than anybody else, they can recognize what's wrong with it.
Thank you. Mark Otwell, unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Fabrizio, for your wonderful conversation today, and also La Società for organizing these webinars. I really enjoy it. I'm very interested in your perspective, specifically on your perception of the role of Quebec in particular, and the changes that are occurring in Quebec society over the years that you've observed. I'm fortunate enough, I'm an unusual kind of Canadian, I think, in that I'm an Anglophone from the prairies who works in French primarily, and lives on the West Coast. So I kind of have a little bit of piece of me in three different, really distinct and different regions of the country. I lived in Montreal in the 80s, then moved away, and now I'm back connected to the city and the province through my work. So I've observed some substantial changes, both in the society and in the role of Quebec in Canada, and the perception that Canadians have outside of Quebec. So I'd be very interested to hear your perceptions from your perspective.
Well, thank you. I haven't been to Canada since 2018, so I'm missing on the last momentous years of COVID and all that. What I did notice from my first experience, I was first in Canada between 02 and 06, then back between 14 and 18. And I noticed a few things. The first one is that the first time I went, I found Quebec society to be more on the defensive. And in Montreal, you would only hear French, and young people were not keen on engaging in English. And I could still sense some resentment on the Anglo side. I mean, I remember when you were in Ottawa and you went for dinner on the other side of the Ottawa River, you would only hear French. I mean, the Anglos would not go for dinner in Quebec and vice versa. And I found this has kind of relaxed. When I went camping with my friends, my Canadian friends in Quebec, they would enter the hardware store and would say a sentence in French, bonjour, comment ça va, and then switch to English. And the French clerk would acknowledge that and reply in English. And then again, the separatist talk has largely died down. That was my impression. The last time I observed the Canadian election, the Bloc Québécois took a minimal amount of vote. So I think that Quebec has found its place within Canada. And of course, maybe the difference is that Quebec, but French Canadians in general, are much more aware of their identity as Francophone North Americans. I remember a person trying to explain it to me that what is in Quebec is not multicultural multiculturalism, but interculturalism, meaning that there is still this dominant presence of the French element that is a matter of fact. And then, of course, I also find that the French element enriches Canada. The flair of the language, the joie de vivre, and the different approach that on many facts of life, the music. I think that it's a plus for Canada. And I don't think that, yes.
Sorry, go ahead, sorry.
No, just closings that I don't think that the political element will be as disruptive as it was a few decades ago.
Thank you, Fabrizio. There is a comment, more kind of a statement more than a question, by Christian Nageli, who says there was a pre and post World War I Italian immigration wave from northern and southern Italy, most driven by poverty and not always specialized work skills. They had a harder time climbing the social ladder. So there were two different sets of Italians who migrated to Italy. That's what Christian is saying here.
Exactly, yes. No, that is true, because the bulk of the migration, I'm again looking at numbers, was in the post-war, but in the pre-war years, migration was mostly of unskilled labor. And yes, they did have a harder time. And on top of that, during the war, there was a very sad episode of Italians being interned as enemy aliens. That was, of course, it happened during the war, and the end, nobody got hurt, but it was a sad page of discrimination that Canada acknowledged already in the 80s. So I fully agree with the statement that it was harder for Italians in the pre-war years.
And there is also another kind of comment, but perhaps you can answer also, or perhaps a further comment on that, by Manuela, who says, I see a completely different perspective when I visit Italy. The people there I know and meet have no interest in coming to Canada. They are very happy with their lives and do not want to leave even the smallest commune. But smallest comune, so she's wording the comune, Italian commune or little town.
Of course, it depends on where you look from. My experience is more that of the big city. I'm from Rome, and people in metros maybe tend to look abroad a lot more than for opportunities. Often in smaller towns, people are happy with their lives and would feel uncomfortable just moving 100 kilometers down the road or under another hill. So, well, of course, everything must be put in perspective. It's not like 60 million of Italians moving abroad. But among the younger and the most educated classes, then I would say that North America, together with some Western European countries, is on top of the list.
Thank you, Fabrizio. We have several questions also from the chat, but let's have first Dr. D. Archibald. Other question?
I actually have a comment, but I would be with respect to the reference to Indigenous peoples and their culture, given that as a Canadian who has spent the last 23 years, well, up until the pandemic, unfortunately less the last couple of years, in spending at least half of every year in the last 2 decades in Italy with UNESCO. And my work and our sede is in Florence, and my work is intersects. I'm an international heritage expert, so I work with cultural heritage and Indigenous peoples. And my work intersects cultural heritage and human rights. So I'm very interested to hear that your role right now in Warsaw. In any case, all of that to say, I would prefer to listen to Fabrizio's response to the comment in the chat about multiculturalism and indigeneity, Indigenous peoples, before I respond to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. What I was able to observe about Indigenous people, and of course, I'm no expert. I was I simply had an overview, but I did notice that the element is very much present into the Canadian debate. And again, comparing with 20 years ago, in Canada, the Indigenous people are front and center, as they should be, as they are not only a component of society, but they are the first nation. The word says it. So what is the component of the Indigenous people in multiculturalism? Well, it is, I think, a different take, because the Indigenous people, that's my opinion, are not just one element among the others, but they're actually the founding element of Canada. They've been neglected for far too many years, and now they're back into the center of the narrative. I think that is maybe a seismic shift that has happened in the past few years, and it's there to stay. I don't see any of this backpedaling or anything. There is not only awareness, but also interest and in First Nation culture. And as I said, I was very much impressed when there was the Canadian G7 presidency in 2018, and where was it, in Whistler, and so it was. And just to underscore that this is our ancestral land, never ceded, and everybody found this to be an element of enrichment, again, because it's a part of Canada that maybe is not as present in popular imagination. And we're going back to perceptions. And in Italy, the traditional image of Canada is from the 1950s and 60s, maybe, of the mountains and of the forest and all that. And the First Nations don't quite fit. But I think it's a key element to understand contemporary Canada. I mean, you cannot simply ignore it. You have to look into it and understand it, or at least make an attempt if you want to understand Canada.
Thank you.
May I respond
Yes, sure.
to that, because I wanted to hear very much. Thank you very much for sharing that. As a non-Indigenous person, the last 30 years of my life, including my doctorate, is in looking at the cultural meaning of the built heritage of Indigenous peoples along the Pacific coast. And that led me to a postdoc at La Sapienza, which led me to the post with as on an advisory capacity to UNESCO World Heritage Center. And so I find myself in Europe, in Italy, sitting with my colleagues in these meetings, advocating for Indigenous inclusion at the UNESCO World Heritage level, which is an interesting position and sometimes challenging position to be in. So I'm thank you very much for articulating how you see the Indigenous peoples within the multicultural context that you've been discussing. And I agree with you fully that the Indigenous peoples, as you said, are the ancestral peoples of this land, and that this is not to be included, or it's not the same discussion as multiculturalism. And thank you for making that distinction. It's very much my position as well. And as you very diplomatically noted, we are on, especially in British Columbia, we're on unceded territory. So if the Indigenous peoples wanted to push us off, they have every legal right to do that. And I also found that, I mean, it's most interesting too to have your concept of Canada's identity, because growing up in Canada in the sector of architecture, going into restoration, intersecting with cultural rights and human rights, it certainly has been a challenge. When you consider questions of cultural identity. And living in Italy, as you said, there's a very solid, almost very secure feeling of identity. And we struggle with, cultural heritage and safeguarding the diverse cultural heritage in Canada, where what I find very impressive in Italy is that Italians' cultural heritage, the patrimonio, is protected in the Constitution. every Italian has the right to access their cultural heritage. And I wish we were there in Canada, but we are so far away. And I agree fully with you. I've never looked at it that way, but I think you're quite right. It's our identity is evolving and something to think about. So thank you very much for this enriching discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Archibald. And I think Stefano Gulmanelli has a few comments on this, on the same subject.
Yeah, I'll be short. Don't worry. And it's a comment that I don't want to appear the spoiler. I just want to bring the attention on the fact that diversity is definitely something that enriches society. It lowers the entropy of society, so it's something which definitely is something to be pursued. On the other hand, and I don't want to get academic here, let's set aside all the academia, but I think it's common sense. We understand that diversity, there is a relationship between the amount of diversity, social cohesion, and social trust. Everyone who wants to investigate on that could do that with a Google search. And with injection of diversity within a framework of hard multiculturalism, like it's the one that is pursued in Canada, that might create some tensions, might be the recipe for some underlying issues that sooner or later might emerge. Therefore, the need for a constant narrative that we experience in the attempt to, create this layer of values, which to some extent try to replace the need for a national identity. Because, I happen to go in classes at uni and teaching about national identity and stuff like that. And I was impressed by a student, a female student. We were discussing Canadian national identity, and she said, well, maybe we don't need a national identity. Now, that's quite a statement, because you might want not to have a national identity, but identity is also something that other people give to you. So there is a negotiation there that is going on, and you be better in control of that negotiation, possibly, and not having a national identity imposed upon you. Again, I'm throwing this comment. I don't want to be a party spoiler, and I'm done with it. Thank you so much, Fabrizio, for every thought that you are, the brainstorming that you are bringing to us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for stirring up the discussion. And I think you raised an important point, because indeed multiculturalism is not a value per se, but it's also instrumental at keeping a society together. That's something which I think I understood really between the lines of Canadian history. It began with the purpose of keeping French Canada in, then it developed, but there always has to be a core of reference. And maybe, yes, values are not just enough. There should be a number of symbols of shared history of, I don't quite know what. Maybe that's where Canada struggles a bit compared with European countries that have a stronger set of identities. Then, of course, mind you, identities are thrown at everyone. I mean, as an Italian, I can tell you I've been associated with fine food and party-going ministers and that kind of things all the time. But yes, you must be in control of the narrative. That is fundamental. And this is what Canada, it'll take time, it'll take generations. But it cannot be a post-national society. I've read people even using that comment, and it's much as one can aspire to it, we still need nations in today's world.
If I may, I totally agree with the last statement, but I want also to get back to what Dr. Archibald was saying. It's the countries that do have an issue with the legitimacy to the control of the territory are the ones that struggle to create a national identity. Europe doesn't have that. Well, or at least there is very effective narratives that link the nation to the territory. Here in Australia, another place that we've been, we lived there, and I had my doctorate there actually on national identity and so on, where you have a population that do have a right to the territory that is earlier than you and probably more legitimate than the one that you have, then you struggle to come up with something which is meaningful and that you can really claim some sort of national unity on that territory. That's enough for me. Sorry about that.
There is also, thank you for that. There is also another comment by Elio da Costa that I can share with you in the chat. I find multiculturalism a complete failure, with different groups bringing to Canada the divisions they had in their native lands, even creating violent incidents and creating numerous hyphenated Canadians, rather than integrating and abiding by what used to be the traditional Canadian values. Also, the indigenous blessings you mentioned before meetings, I find it an intrusion of religion into the state, as Canada is a secular state. Thus, in my opinion, this is offensive.
Point taken.
And also there is Margaret, sorry, just a little bit earlier, who made another comment on the fact that there are certain aggressive behaviors in certain, perhaps, communities in their cultural affirmation. Comments to share: Quebec's cultural, legal, and political individuality is unique. The cultural impact, strong identity, and aggressive provincial efforts to preserve language. We are seeing other aggressive evolutions of identity based on political values. Think of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and their contentious debates with Ottawa on carbon capture and gender identity. So Canada is complicated.
Oh, it is. It is. I would rather not enter into the minutiae of political debate. And that's a debate which Canadians are best equipped to carry out. I simply don't have all the tools, and I don't feel like as an outsider, I should intrude too much on this. As I said at the beginning, the overarching object of my work was to introduce Canada to Italians with all its complexities. And I mean, I find it fascinating that I was able to start such a lively discussion on issues that I felt strongly in Canada. So I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Fabrizio. And here the diplomat comes out, of course. Yes, and at this point, we just have to leave the final remarks to Renato Zane, sorry, the president of our society, that can wrap up a bit this very fruitful and interesting discussion. Unmute yourself, Renato.
Thank you for the reminder. And thank you, Fabrizio, for your very wide-ranging presentation. I think that you did an excellent job of summarizing what's in your book, but then, as Stefano said, opening up a Pandora's box. And I was very curious to think about, from a diplomatic perspective, how diplomats like yourself or people in Italy see Canada's future. And I think that's the big question we have in front of us is where are we going with the successes of the past and the challenges of the future? And it's very clear that we all can use a civics lesson. And this wasn't Canada 101 course today. This was a Canada 301 or Canada 401. So it's fantastic to see that all of our members who have participated today are so well read and so invested in this conversation. It's obviously something that we care a lot about, and it's a pleasure to have this brought out by someone who was a visitor to Canada and represented Italy and wrote about us, or this reality, let's say, for the benefit of Italians. I think that a lot of Canadians can use this kind of perspective in understanding themselves. So Thank you for your service today, Fabrizio, and thank you all who participated in this lively discussion. Lots of food for thought here, lots to think about and to consider. And why not, even from a political perspective? You know, we will have elections in a couple of years, and I think these are going to come bubbling up as politicians will try to touch the nerve centers that really affect so many of us Canadians. So I know this will be a bit of an early start for us as a primer to think about where we all stand come election time. But most importantly, you know, most of us here are Italian Canadians. And so we appreciate the opportunity of looking at ourselves in the mirror and thinking about our families and thinking about our heritage and thinking about what it means to be an Italian living in Canada or a Canadian of Italian heritage living in Canada. And it's one reason why I'm so happy to be part of this organization. The Dante Society of BC strives to bring people together in these kinds of conversations to promote Italian culture, Italian heritage, and the Italian language. So along those lines, let me just conclude by reminding everybody that we are always looking for new members. So if you'd like to sign up for a membership, it's only $40 a year, and it gives you lots of discounts, including discounts on language courses. Our winter session has started for the language courses. The new one will be in the spring. But don't forget that we're also a presidio literario for the book club. And so we have some very interesting and lively, stimulating conversations around Italian books. The next meeting is going to be on the 10th of February, and the group will be discussing a work by Gesualdo Bufalino. So that's coming up. If you're interested in those kinds of discussions, please check our website at BC, the Dante Society of BC website, and you'll find all the information you'll need there. And lastly, I'd just like to remind you that if you have any suggestions or ideas for activities that you think the Dante Society should be involved in or should be engaged in the future, please feel free to send us an email. You'll find the email address on the website as well. So, and finally, I just want to thank Arianna for her excellent job in coordinating these events and for the hard work that goes into not only finding our speakers, but also moderating these conversations. So thank you all, and thank you, Arianna. We really appreciate all of your participation.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Fabrizio Nava, and have a wonderful weekend.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Grazie mille.
Grazie, ciao.
Tante grazie, arrivederci.